Okay.
All right, so welcome back to the Young Idealist and my ongoing series on classical German philosophy. And today I have a very special guest. I have Dr. Wouter J. Hanegraaf here, who is a professor in the history of Hermetic philosophy and related currents in the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Amsterdam, to talk about Carl August von Eschenmayer, as well as the poet Justinus Kerner and the Seeres of Prevorst. And Dr. Hanegraaf has written about these issues. I was first introduced to Dr. Hanegraaf's work with his work actually on Ludovico Lazzarelli, and then we began discussing Eschenmayer. He is the author of The Hermetic Spirituality and Historical Imagination, Altered States of Knowledge in Late Antiquity, published in 2022, as well as Esotericism and the Academy, Rejected Knowledge in Western Culture in 2014, and of course, Western Esotericism, A Guide for the Perplexed in 2013, and many other books. So Dr. Hanegraaf, thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be on your channel.
Well, thank you so much. And today we're talking about a thinker that has been absolutely neglected from the history of German idealism and the history of classical German philosophy, as well as minor but important figures that are related to Eschenmayer's work and have such an impact on Eschenmayer. So maybe before we begin, you can give us a brief introduction on who Eschenmayer was and the time that he lived in.
Yeah, I'll be happy to do that. Yeah, I agree. He's a really neglected figure, and he really deserves more attention. Also because he was, and we will talk about it, he was one of the major sparring partners of Schelling around 1800. And really, he was important. Schelling even seems to have taken some ideas from Eschenmayer and run with it. So that's interesting. Anyway, yeah, so who was Eschenmayer? He was born in 1768. And first his father wanted him to have a commercial career, but he didn't want it. He wanted to pursue an intellectual career. After the death of his father, he was able to do that. And he ended up studying first medicine and also philosophy. All these fields were interwoven in this period. So there's quite a lot of psychology in his work as well. I think it's an important part of his work, actually. He published his dissertation in 1796, and that dissertation was read by Schelling, who got interested. So Schelling got in touch with him, and they ended up having quite an intense discussion, which was important for Schelling in this period. And yeah, this has been recently been brought to the attention of an English language readership. There's this book by Benjamin Berger and Daniel Whistler, which came out not so long ago, about this episode, and which also contains English translations of the relevant articles, the discussion between Eschenmayer and Schelling, so on. So that happened, but then at one point, Schelling and Eschenmayer, yeah, they got into a fight because yeah, Schelling disagreed with Eschenmayer on an essential point. Yeah, because Eschenmayer believed that if you want to talk about the absolutes, there are limits to the human ability to talk about the absolute. And at one point, you have to leave philosophy behind and to rely on faith, on Christian faith. And Schelling didn't want to accept that, but that was what Eschenmayer was saying, and they basically broke over that. Eschenmayer became a professor of philosophy in Tübingen, quite a central place in Württemberg, and that was 1811 to 1812. And I think a very important moment came in 1817. He published a large three-part psychology, one of the earliest, I think, attempts to really have a kind of comprehensive psychological system. It was republished in 1822, and I think it's an important work, and maybe we can talk a bit about it. Then in 1817, shortly after 1817, after the publication of this book, there came a shift in Eschenmayer's thinking, because he read publications about a famous exorcist, a Catholic exorcist, Gassner, who was known for exorcising demons from his patients. And Eschenmayer gets totally fascinated, obsessed even, with the phenomenon of demonic possession and exorcism. And that becomes very, very important to him in his later work, even to the point where it started hurting his own reputation. And then because of this, he gets more and more interested in the work of a colleague of his, a medical colleague, Justinus Kerner, who is one of the minor German poets of the period, and a physician who was working in Weinsberg in Germany, and who had been writing about possession cases and about somnambulic mesmeric patients. And so he got into contact in 1827. He meets Kerner, they become friends, they become colleagues and collaborators in all kinds of ways. And in this way, Eschenmayer gets introduced to the fascinating case of the so-called Seeres of Prevorst, or the visionary of Prevorst, a woman whose name was Friedrich Wilhelm, born in 1801, and she died in 1829, very young, 28 years old. She was a patient of Kerner, who displayed fascinating, spectacular paranormal and visionary abilities. So that was totally fascinating to both Kerner and Eschenmayer. In the year of her death, Kerner publishes a book that became a bestseller immediately, Die Seeres of Prevorst, the Seers of Prevorst, about his patient. And Eschenmayer contributed basically all the theoretical parts to that book. You don't immediately see this, it's not published under his name, but actually all the theoretical and philosophical parts come from Eschenmayer. This book gets published. It became extremely controversial. So it really led to a separation between people who believed in all these paranormal and visionary phenomena that were associated with mesmerism and somnambulism, and on the other hand, the critics who thought that all of this was just total nonsense. So this leads to a sharp debates in the popular media of the time. It also leads to, they both became so famous because this patient, Friedrich Wilhelm, was very sick. But she had visions. She was said to be in contact with spirits and angels in the higher world and so on. And people came all over Germany to visit her at her bed and to listen to the messages from the spirits and so on. So this made her famous. But it's also led to Kerner and Eschenmayer to be lampooned in the popular literature as a couple of, ridiculous, superstitious people who just, so the critics were really, really very harsh on them. You find this in this famous book by Immermann on the Baron von Münchhausen, a very famous book. The Baron von Münchhausen, some parts of it are still well known, but everybody has forgotten that a large part of the book is entirely about Kerner and Eschenmayer, who are presented there under quite transparent pseudonyms. So Kernbeißer and Eschenmichel. And if you know German, these are slightly, ridiculous names. Kernbeißer, somebody who's biting on a core or something like that, and Eschenmichel sounds ridiculous as well. So it is really an attempt to make fun of these people. But this made him famous also by an influential literary author like Immermann. Well, Eschenmayer gets more and more interested in paranormal phenomena, and especially in possession cases and exorcism. And in 1837, he publishes a book which really ruined his reputation, his intellectual reputation, because he was so credulous at this point. There was a certain kind of a con man who was selling him all kinds of stories that were clearly untrue, and he believed them. And so that was very bad for his reputation. So unfortunately, this man who was an interlocutor with Schelling and an extremely interesting and serious and fascinating thinker, should be taken seriously, has unfortunately, his reputation was damaged so much that he has been forgotten and written out of history. He finally died in 1852, and in a state of depression, because he really felt that the whole way that philosophy and general culture were developing was terrible, and he was extremely pessimistic about the future. So yeah, he goes through his whole development in his thinking, and it's always on the verge between mesmerism and somnambulism, paranormal phenomena, strict philosophical, high-level philosophical reasoning, and psychology, and also religious topics like possession, and so on. So for all of these topics come together, and he has produced an enormous number of publications. It's really impressive, enormous number of publications, which nobody reads anymore. So I wrote an article about this in English, which was actually a couple of years ago, the very first English article ever written about Eschenmayer, just briefly before the book that I just showed you. But it says something about the neglect into which he has fallen. So.
And the article that you wrote about Eschenmayer's philosophy is really quite exceptional. You go into great detail of Eschenmayer's Naturphilosophie, which plays a part to this theory of animal magnetism and mesmerism. And there's in a sense, there's this kind of Schellingian dialectical polarization, the subject of knowledge being humankind, mankind, its object being nature, and to achieve absolute freedom, right? The soul is in this kind of realm of absolute freedom, and there's a bodily organism that always is pulling down the spiritual essence, right? And there's always this mediation point, the indifference point, which is also in Schelling's philosophy as well, too. And there's a kind of positive spiritual principle and a negative counterpart to materiality. Do you think we can maybe go through some of the elements of Eschenmayer's nature philosophy before we?
But no, basically, so like you say, his worldview is based upon this polarization. So yeah, so you have the plus pole, which is absolute freedom, spirit, and the negative pole, which is matter, which is ruled by law. So you have law-like, laws, natural law against spiritual freedom. It's the kind of basic polar opposition. And then the human soul is in between the two. And I think he's deeply Platonic in his way of thinking. I think that the human soul is also the principle of consciousness. It's dominated by the imagination. He has a lot to say about the imagination as the kind of central dimension of consciousness. And the human soul has two sides. So the higher side of the soul looks upwards to the spiritual, and it is described very much in Platonic terms. The higher world, the higher spiritual world, is all about truth, beauty, and goodness. The good, the beautiful, and the true. And those are so the soul looks upward towards what he calls das urbildliche Leben, the archetypal life up there. But then you have the lower, the abbildliches Leben, the copy of that in the material world, the material imprint, if you will, of the eternal ideas in the world. And the soul has the unique capacity of seeing both sides, moving upwards, looking upwards, and looking downwards at the same time. And if I may, this is also something that is deeply hermetic in the sense of the traditional hermetic philosophy. As you just mentioned, I wrote a book about ancient hermetic literature. It's the same thing. The human being has a unique place in the world, because only the human beings participate in both realities at the same time. They are double. My friend Jeff Kripal at the University of Houston Rice University at Houston in Texas, would call this the human S2, the double nature of the human being who looks both upwards and both downwards and is different in this respect from any other creature in the world. And I think this is what you find in Eschenmayer as well, this double nature. So yeah, then on the basis of that, he has this whole theory that he develops about, about knowledge. What kind of knowledge can we have? It's his large book about psychology. He has a kind of a very theoretical part about pure knowledge and pure consciousness, which is very, abstract, Naturphilosophie, very much so. And then you have also in practical, angewandt, applied psychology, which is really undeveloped. But there's a middle part which is interesting, which is what he calls the empirical psychology. And it's totally dominated by mesmerism. And I do not know whether your viewers know a lot about mesmerism and somnambulism. Should I say say a few things about?
Yeah, no, I think since we're on this, we're going to talk about these interrelated matters.
Well, a few things about mesmerism, because I think it's very important. So Schelling's dissertation was about magnetism in the physical sense. So that was really about nature. And that was the dissertation that Schelling read. And then his second major book is also about mesmerism. No, sorry, about magnetism. But now he talks about not physical magnetism, magnetic forces, but he talks about what was known as animal magnetism, which is, by the way, a problematic term because sometimes it is so tierischer magnetismus, animal magnetism, then people think it's about animals. There's nothing to do with animals. It's just animal in the sense of referring to the soul. So it's really soul magnetism. So the forces of magnetism, which is of course about polarity plus and minus, which is central to Schelling for obvious reasons, you also find here. So you find the polarity between plus and minus, magnetic forces in nature, and you find it also in the soul. And that is what Eschenmayer is interested in. Now, his whole theoretical framework is deeply indebted to the work of Franz Anton Mesmer, who was an 18th century physician, really from the Enlightenment, persuasion in the 18th century, who, as a physician, developed this and discovered this method of healing, which he saw as revolutionary. Basically, his assumption was that there is a universal life force that runs through the human. Our organism is polarized as well between plus and minus. There's a magnetic life force that runs through our body, and illnesses, sicknesses result basically from disturbances in the life force. That was the assumption. So if you can remove the blockages in the life force, then illnesses will be solved. And he did this by making passes, so-called passes, over the body of the patient. So, and then the magnetism, the life force of his own body would interact with the life force of the patient, and the two would be restored to harmony. And then, as a result of that, the patient would enter a kind of a crisis. It was described as a crisis in which you get strong emotions. They would start shouting and screaming, etc. But when the crisis was over, then the life force would be restored and the patient would start feeling better. Now, this kind of practice became very popular. It became extremely popular at the time. This is another topic that has been still not received enough attention, the enormous impact it had on the whole generation of the German idealists in Germany, certainly, and generally in the culture. It was developed later also in new directions that are known as somnambulism. And this comes from a French pupil of Mesmer, de Puységur, who discovered something essential, that he brought his patients into a mesmeric state, and this resulted in a kind of a trance state. So people were in a sleep-like, trance-like state by being mesmerized. That's what happened. But what the Figuur discovered is that in this state, they almost became like different persons, like they developed abilities that they didn't have in their normal life. So he has the descriptions of one of his servants. The Figuur was very wealthy, had a large estate, and one of his servants, who was unlettered and had no education and so on, suddenly spoke high German in a trance state, seemed to become a different person, and was reporting visions and all kind of paranormal perceptions that were totally out of his abilities in a normal state. And these patients started reporting all kinds of phenomena that we would nowadays refer to as psychical or paranormal phenomena. And so this was very spectacular. You get organizations all over Germany and France and England as well, devoted to the study of these techniques, because these are easy to apply techniques. Everybody could do it. You could learn the techniques and you could put people into a trance, and they turned out to have all these amazing strange abilities. Now that became popular, very popular, and that's also at the basis of the story of the Seers of Prevorst, the pupil of Justinus Kerner and Eschenmayer, because she was a somnambulic patient who had a lot of experience with this strange altered state of consciousness. Or in his in Eschenmayer's psychological system, mesmerism and somnambulism is absolutely central. That is, for him, this is the key for understanding the nature of the soul. So the same kind of, I mean, it's a natural match. The polar opposites in Schelling's Naturphilosophie, the polarization of magnetism, both on a physical and on a psychological level. It's very easy to bring these theories together. And Eschenmayer develops a complete, very complicated psychology based upon three parallel abilities of the soul, which develop through our life. So one ability is focused on truth, on the true, another on beauty, and another on goodness. So again, the good, the beautiful, and the true. And so then he has this whole schema that you go through stages from a baby to childhood to adolescence to maturity and to old age, and you develop your abilities. So just to mention them, I think it's fascinating. So our ability to understand the truth develops from pure physical sensation as a baby. Then as a child, you develop your imagination. Then in adolescence, you develop your mind. Then in maturity, you develop your reason as well, which he distinguishes from each other. And in old age, you should reach conscience, gewissen. So there's also a moral side to this. And then with respect to beauty, it's the same thing. So the baby perceives things, but that in childhood we develop our Einbildungskraft, on our reproductive imagination. That comes later. Then we develop our feeling capacity. Then we develop our fantasy and maturity. And in old age, we could develop these abilities into visionary abilities. So when you go through an ideal state of development, in your old age, you might become a visionary, and you get so close to the divine that then when you die, you are very close. You've gotten very close to divinity, right? So that is the whole ideal development. And the same for goodness. The baby has a natural instinct, a Naturinstinct. Then in childhood, we have lower desires, that's niedere Begehrungsvermögen, lower desires. Then in adolescence, we develop das Gemüt, which I translate as the heart. So knowledge of the heart and goodness of the heart, that develops in adolescence. Then in maturity, we should develop our will, our willpower. And finally, as old people, we develop faith. So when we get older, we start to develop the Christian truths of Christian faith. And again, these prepare us for the transition beyond death, when we hopefully will find our way to heaven. So it's a very Christian philosophical and psychological worldview. So he has this whole complicated, distinct spectrum of consciousness, and it's developed in greater detail. And it's, I think, it's based on, on several pillars. He was very well acquainted with Kantian philosophy. He really studied Kant, and Kant is very important to him, remained important to him also after his contact with Schelling. But then there's, of course, Schelling, and there is mesmeric thinking and somnambulic thinking, and a lot of Christian theology as well, which he all mixes together in this grand synthesis. And it really belongs to the time, to this time, of course, but it is very impressive, and it's intellectual on a high level, and it deserves to be taken more seriously than it has been.
All right, so I guess we can now move into Eschenmayer's relation to Justinus Kerner, who of course was a poet, romantic poet, as well as a medical practitioner, a physician, and Friedrich Haufe.
Yeah. So I think it's best if I first tell the short outline of the story of Justinus Kerner and the Seeres, and then we can move from there to Eschenmayer. Maybe that will work best. Justinus Kerner has been one of my fascinations basically all my life since I was a student. I came across him, and he's fascinating in many ways. So as I said, he was a minor romantic poet. His poems are still, part of general overviews of romantic poetry. He became a physician. He practiced in Weinsberg in Württemberg. I've been there several times. And if you go to Weinsberg, I can recommend it. It's beautiful to go there. And because in the center of the town, you have the large Kerner house, his house, which has been turned into a museum now because Weinsberg is proud of Kerner. He's the most important citizen that they have in their history. So this was a big house, which is now a museum, which functioned as a kind of a small hospital at the time when he was working there. Kerner was a figure of authority in Weinsberg. He was educated. He had a great personality. He was, as he has been called, a Genie der Freundschaft, a genius of friendship. So people came to his house, and they had all these gatherings. Just as a footnote, I cannot help myself telling this story. Also in Weinsberg, you have a big hill called the Weibertreu, women's faith, women's women's faith. Let's call it that way. That goes back to a medieval story. Once upon a time, the people of Weinsberg had been attacked by the enemy. All the citizens of Weinsberg had withdrawn on the top of the Weibertreu, of the hill, which wasn't called Weibertreu yet at that moment. There's a big hill next to the city, which you can still climb nowadays. And they were surrounded by the enemies, and the enemies was going to kill all of them. So they were in dire straits, and they reached a negotiation with the enemy, who said, okay, the women are allowed to leave, and they can only take with them what they can carry on their backs, and for the rest, that's it. So, and then all the women came out, and they carried their husbands on their back. And in this way, the women of Weinsberg saved the men from the city. And so now this is why the hill is being called Weibertreu, women's faith. And it's still a beautiful hill. You can climb that. There are ruins on the top. And I mention it also because the Romantic poets and philosophers, and basically the Romantics, came to Weinsberg, and they had their meetings on the top of the hill. You can find the names of many famous poets still inscribed in the walls, in the ruins at the top of Weibertreu, famous names. So Justinus Kerner knew everybody. They knew him. He was an important figure. So he is the main physician of Weinsberg, and he was trained as a normal physician, but he had also learned the techniques of mesmerism and somnambulism. This was part of medical practice at that time. It was controversial, but it was also widespread. So he was using that. he had gotten interested in phenomena of somnambulism. He had already written a book about 2 somnambulic patients whom he treated and who got better. And this is the reason probably why Eschenmayer got interested in him, because he read the book. But what happened in 1826, Kerner got interrupted in the middle of the day by a couple of people came with a big cart, and they basically deposited a patient in front of his door. And this was Friedrich Wilhelm. And they basically inflicted this patient on him because they didn't know how to cure her, and he was famous as a physician, so he should cure her. So now he had to treat her, and so he took her in. And first he treated her very severely, but eventually got very much impressed by her, and she stayed in his house, in his small hospital, for 2.5 years, until briefly before her death. So they got to know each other very well. Now her background is fascinating because she came from a place called Prevorst. That's why she came to be known as the Seers of Prevorst, a small forestry, village somewhere. She was a sensitive child. She, for reasons that are not entirely well known, spent large part of her childhood from her 6th to her 12th year, I think, living with her family, with the family of her grandfather, actually in another place. She developed a strong relationship with her grandfather, who was a very impressive personality. But somewhere in this period, something must have happened, and nobody knows exactly what, but I have discovered in my research that there's evidence for sexual abuse that took place between her 6th and her 12th year. Evidence that you can find in the first edition of the Seers of Prevorst, in the book that Kerner later published, and which was deleted in all the later editions, probably because the family was disturbed that the secret came out about how she had been sexually abused, probably by an uncle. So there's something that happened there. But it was covered up by the family. But this was the kind of secret. She finally came back to her parents. At one point, when she got older, she was very sensitive and sickly, etc. Her parents wanted to marry her out. Well, she didn't have any say in the matter, so they decided that she should marry a distant relative, a merchant called Haufe. And so her name was Wanner, but she married a guy called Haufe, so she became known as Friedrich Haufe. So she married him very much against her will. But something weird happened. That's part of the story, of the canonical story, is that not very long before her marriage, she was already engaged to get married. It was clearly she didn't want to marry. She was a spiritually oriented woman. If she had been Catholic, she would undoubtedly have become a nun, but she was a Lutheran, so she couldn't do that. But she didn't want to marry. She wanted a spiritual life. So she was worried about being forced to marry this man she hardly knew. She had developed a very strong friendship with the minister of the village. And apparently they had a very close and very personal friendship, friendly relation. And he was very important to her. Then he died, and it turned out that he got buried exactly on the same day when her engagements should take place. So for her, this was an incredible coincidence. Her most intimate friend, who understood her, who listened to her, died and was buried on the very same day that she had to marry this man that she didn't want to marry. So this was a traumatic moment, but she went to the grave, and she saw the spirit of the minister, of this friend of hers, hovering over the grave, and a kind of quiet came over her, and she felt that God was telling her to abandon herself to his will and to accept the marriage and no longer fight against it. Okay, and that's what happened. She got married. She moved into the house of her husband. And everything seemed to be going reasonably okay until I think a half a year later, in the middle of the night, suddenly she wakes up out of a terrible nightmare. And because she dreamt that next to her in bed was lying not her husband, but the corpse of the minister of her friend was lying in bed. And and she cries out that don't take me away from this corpse because he will heal me. Only he will heal me. Interestingly, she was not sick yet, but from that moment on, she felt sick. I mean, on a latent basis, she probably was already not healthy, but from that moment on, she started developing terrible symptoms, horrible cramps that contorted her whole body, bloody diarrhea, fevers, all kind of. It was a terrible situation. Nothing helped. She was crying and screaming the whole night. Nobody knew what to do about it. Everybody was desperate. And she didn't get better. It just continued and it continued week and months and year after year. Eventually they tried everything, all kind of traditional and alternative healing medicines. They tried exorcism. They tried a magician, amulets, talismans, whatever. Nothing works. And eventually they basically her own family, after several years, basically hoped that she would finally die because it was unbearable. And that is how they came to bring her to Justinus Kerner. Hopefully he could heal her. And they put her in front of his door and they left and deal with it. So, okay. So now he had to deal with this. And at first he was very severe because he felt that she was hysterical and she was putting on to be very severe with her. It didn't work at all. It just got worse. And eventually it turned out that the only thing that helped was mesmeric treatment. And when he did that, then she got calmer and it became possible to control her state to some extent. And that is how the patient Friedrich Haufe developed gradually into what is known as the Seeres of Prevorst, because she was mesmerized every day, so treated with these passes over her body. That resulted in a whole complicated number of trance states, altered states of consciousness, sleep-like states. In these states, she would become the most spectacular mesmeric somnambulic patient known in her time. So she had, and so she displayed, according to Kerner, we only have his testimony, an enormous range of paranormal phenomena, extreme sensitivity to specific substances, all paranormal perceptions, clairvoyance, you name it, everything in the book. She basically was a kind of a clairvoyant virtuoso, something like that, everything. She had visions of spirits. She constantly saw spirits of the departed walking through her room. She was not afraid of them because they were in the in-between state. They had not found their way to heaven yet. And she was trying to instruct them to trust in Jesus Christ as their savior so that they could find their way to heaven, and so on and so forth. And she developed a whole spiritual system of her own. Most spectacular is the circles of the solar circles and the circles of life. It's hard to explain if you don't have the picture here. I have it here, so I don't know whether you can see this, but you see a large circle here, right? So now this circle is a kind of a calendar. So it has small dots circling around the periphery, which are 365 days of the year. And this was a kind of calendar of her life through a whole year. And the inner part of the circle, show it again. So the inner part of the circle shows her inner life. And there's a lot to be said about it. And the external part is the external life. And you see all these signs here, all this, I hope you can see it. These represent disturbances in her life. So a visitor comes, or she has an illness or a medical examination or whatever, which disturbs her, and she notes all of that down. But then there's the inner side as well, and she can, in a trance state, she can escape from the external world into her inner world. But in the inner world, there's a planetary system, and in the very center of our inner world, there is what she calls the Gnadenzonne, the sun of grace, which is the divine light, which is in the very center. And so she can move there and she can look into the mystery of divinity. And there are all kinds of other spirits that she sees there. So in her own inner life, she also meets spirits who are in that same in-between realm. So it's a fascinating story. It is connected to an other circle, and she was drawing those circles in her trance state very precisely. There's a famous painting, which perhaps you'll be able to, where you actually see her lying in bed with one of those circles on her chest. Anyway, the other circle, so this was the sun, was the solar circle, but there's also the circle of life. The circle of life is similar, but different because it is full of scripts in an unknown writing. She had developed her own innere Sprache, her internal language, and a language of her own, which she spoke in a trance state. And eventually, the people who are caring for her learned to understand this language. So there wasn't consistency to it. So they were able to communicate with her in the inner language, and it had an inner script. So a strange writing which does not resemble anything else, but she writes it down. And this inner language, again, is connected with her inner arithmetic, because words and letters correspond to numbers. And there is a whole invisible arithmetic going on, according to her, in our lives, in our bodies, in everything, in reality, which you can think about it as the kind of the invisible script, like a computer script, that we don't see, but that lies at the bottom of the display on our computer screen. So we are living our lives in a three-dimensional reality, but behind it are numbers, which we are not aware of normally, but they are there, just in the same way that you have the computer language that underlines what we see on our screens. Very similar. And she develops a whole inner arithmetic, which is based upon two key numbers. There's the number 10, which applies to all human beings, and there's the number 17 in her case, which applies to her individually. Then whatever happens in her life gets translated into sums, into calculations. And if you live a perfect life, then all the numbers come out as they should, and you live a very long life, and you live very long. But when things go wrong in your life, the arithmetic gets influenced in complicated ways, and the numbers, the total number of your life gets reduced. And so, and most of us don't know this, according to her, because of things that happen in our lives and that we do, everything that happens in our lives, it has an effect on our lifespan. But she says she was aware of that. And so she actually saw the more terrible things happened with her illness, her sickness, etc. Yeah, the quicker she saw her own death coming closer, because she saw the arithmetic and she couldn't, and she kept trying to resolve those puzzles, those arithmetical calculations, and it became more and more and more difficult. So she was also suffering from a kind of arithmetic torture almost, of seeing the underlying structures that other people don't see. Okay, so all of that was part of her story. Well, it's spectacular. So what to make of it? Anybody's guess. But she became famous. People came all over Germany. I think Hegel has been at her bed, if I'm not mistaken. Many other famous names. I do not know about Schelling, but I wouldn't be surprised if he had been there. David Friedrich Strauss was there, and he's written about his experiences there. So people flocked to her bed because she was a visionary who could tell you about the spiritual world. So that happened well. I've written quite at length about the relation between the patient, the female patient, Friedrich Wilhelm, and the male physician in a situation of authority, Justinus Kerner. there's a very interesting power and gender relation between the two, which is a lot could be said about that. But they had a close relationship, and the situation is that Kerner was trying to heal her. Obviously, he was her physician, but there came a moment when he became convinced that she could not be cured anymore. And slowly from a patient, she becomes a visionary for him, and she becomes for him the channel through which he can satisfy his desire to know about life after death and about the nature of reality. So more and more she becomes the kind of the oracle for Justinus Kerner, who is tormented by questions of the meaning of life, life and death, suffering, and so on and so forth. So you get this very complicated relation. At the end of her life, Kerner becomes her pupil, and she becomes the teacher, because she's in touch with the spiritual world, and he's listening to her. And well, she dies at 1829, 29 years old. And in the same year, Kerner publishes this book, The Seers of Prevorst, which, as I said, became an immediate bestseller. And now, few years before that, Eschenmayer had arrived on the scene. So now we have Eschenmayer. As I said, they were both physicians. They were both fascinated by mesmerism. They were both interested in phenomena like possession, etc. They had a lot in common. But Kerner was a humble physician in a small town, and Eschenmayer was a university professor at the University of Tübingen. So he had the authority. And so they started working together. And so there, as I said, there are large parts in the Seers of Prevorst that are actually written by Eschenmayer. Among other things, he gave a long interpretation of her circles, the solar circle and the circle of life. And Eschenmayer was criticized later by people who said, well, basically you're imposing your own philosophy on Friedrich Wilhelm. He denied that. He said, no, it's actually, I am her pupil. She's not my pupil. I learned everything from. He writes in a letter to Kerner, let me just 1 moment. Yeah. In a letter to Kerner, he writes, and this is after her death. Later, he writes to Kerner. He says, with the help of the Zeerin, and here he means the book about her, I succeeded in a way that surprised even myself to develop a newly designed theory, a philosophical theory. One phenomenon always explains another one up to the highest level. And he says, I'm giving these lectures about philosophy right now in Tübingen at this moment in a lecture hall that is filled to capacity. A crowd of listeners is copying them. What I used to propose as theory has now become little more than a mere introduction. So his always naturphilosophical theory has become just a mere introduction towards the revelation that is presented to him by Friedrich Wilhelm. And yet he says there is space for a larger work, namely the theory of the circles. So he has written about the circles, but there's much more. He wanted to write a complete work about her solar circles and circles of life. Every day, he says, I must have more admiration for this woman, but I must also regret all that we neglected to ask her. She should come back. She's dead, but I believe that she's with me, for it is only now that everything becomes clearer to me. And in the end, he says, my whole philosophy slips over into this woman and looks back at me through her Seeres eyes. Am Ende schlüpft meine ganze Philosophie in dieses Weib hinüber und guckt aus ihrer Seeraugen wieder hervor. So basically his whole philosophy has basically slipped into her, and now out of her visionary eyes, his own philosophy looks back at him. That's the way he sees it. She has become the embodiment of the true philosophy that goes far beyond rational understanding, but includes spiritual and religious understanding. So yeah, for her, she was the big revelation.
At one point in your article, you state that Eschenmayer would bring his written works to the Seeres, and she would say yes, no, Yes, this is great. This is exactly, yeah, and this is what you said here is the kind of living embodiment of his philosophy.
Yeah, exactly. And that's for her, that is what he believed. Yeah. So you can see his earlier work that played an important part in his connection with Schelling was called what's exactly the philosophy in its transition to non-philosophy. And there he argued that philosophy can bring us to a certain point, but there is a point where philosophy cannot help us further, and then you have to make the transition towards faith, which is, by the way, very hermetic also. He was not aware of it. I do not think he ever read the Corpus Hermeticum, but you actually find the same argument in the classical Hermetica. Okay, that's another point. But here I think Friedrich Wilhelm was exactly that. So he comes with his Naturphilosophie, but she is talking about the spiritual world. Her soul is gazing towards das urbildliche Leben, the archetypal spiritual realities of the good, the beautiful, and the true. She knows from her own experience, and she can tell him what it's all about. And his philosophy, she, so to speak, breathes life, spiritual life, into his philosophy. So for him, it's a perfect integrated whole. But it also means that philosophy is more than philosophy. Ultimately, it culminates in a spiritual worldview about a higher world, about the Geisterwelt. Yeah.
Yeah, no, your article is perfectly clear, showing the dichotomy between freedom, the spiritual, or even the spiritual organism, and necessity, the matter, the material, the biological organism, and how we move from matter to the spirit.
Yes, and this, by the way, now I realize there's one other aspect. If you may I continue this a little bit? Is that okay?
Yes, please, please.
Yeah, do you have time? We have time for this, you tell me. No, this is actually a very important part of the whole story of Kerner and Eschenmayer, because what they do really, they develop what I call a kind of romantic counter-metaphysics against the Enlightenment. That's really what's happening here. So is goes back to work of Gottlieb Heinrich von Schubert, one of the minor but actually important philosophers in the Restoration periods, in the second generation Romantics. One of his books is called the Symbolism of Dreams, die Nachtseite der Naturwissenschaft, the nocturnal side of natural science. So here you have this idea of the night side of nature, the night side of nature. And that's very important for understanding this, because so Schubert, a major influence on Kerner and Eschenmayer. Schubert, at the beginning of his Symbolism of Dreams, has a beautiful passage. He says, every night when we fall asleep, our soul loses consciousness, but our soul actually wakes up in another reality, in the reality of the dreams. And then the soul starts to speak its own natural language, which is the language of symbols and images, not discursive language, but the language of symbols. So there is the nocturnal world in which the soul speaks its own natural language of symbols and images. And then we wake up towards the daylight world, in which we forget all of that and we start speaking discursive language of words. Now, the basic argument that he and Kerner develop in the Seers of Prevorst is that it's totally directed against the Enlightenment. So Enlightenment philosophers believe, well, they are living in a daylight world of enlightenment, of rational enlightenment, but it's a superficial world in which you see only the surface of things. They think it's all there is, but actually they do not see the deeper side of reality. They're blind to it. And so the moment that you fall asleep, or that you not just fall asleep, but you enter into a trance state, like Friedrich Wilhelm doesn't like the somnambulists do, they actually leave the daylight world of rationality and they enter a deeper spiritual nighttime world, a nocturnal world of images and symbols, which are much more appropriate to talk about the true spiritual nature of reality. So actually the Enlightenment is deluded. And when you enter into an altered state of sleep or trance, then your eyes are open. So actually, when you fall asleep, your eyes open in the deeper spiritual nighttime world. And when you wake up, your eyes close and you become blind to reality. And you see only the external world and you think it's all there is. So this is a kind of, what I call a kind of romantic counter-metaphysics, which basically says that trance states, altered states of consciousness like trance, like somnambulic trance, but also normal dreaming, but all these altered states, they are the avenues for seeing the world as it really is. What the Enlightenment scientist and philosopher sees as the real world is just an illusion. It's just the outside, the external, flat, superficial, outside manifestation of reality. So this is a complete romantic counter-metaphysics against the Enlightenment. And this also explains that for Eschenmayer and Kerner, and many people like them, because they're certainly not alone, altered states of consciousness like these, like trance states, like somnambulism, are the key for understanding reality. And purely rational philosophy is actually a delusion. It's very strong. And this, of course, explains also why they got attacked so very, very strongly after the bestseller came out, because they were the very antitheses of science and rationality.
Yet, just a side note. I mean, they're at the in 1805, not to bring him up again, but Schelling and Franz von Baader with Maria von Baader were doing seances. Were interested in the spirit world. Schelling actually has a piece, a dialogue called Clara on the spirit world. And there is a clear division between the scientist, the material world, a priest in the dialogue, which is the spiritual world, and Clara, who plays the intermediator in it. So these are ideas, these are not just, they shouldn't be neglected ideas. They're in the literature there already.
Yes, and it's often, and absolutely, I 100% agree. And it's also, we have to be careful with translations, because Schelling, Clara, and in other places, and all the romantics and the German idealists, they talk about die Geisterwelt. And it always gets translated as the spiritual world or something like that. Or the world, but it is the world of spirits. Grammatically, it means the world of spirits. It's not just some kind of spiritual world. It's literally a world filled with spirits. Geisterwelt, that is what it means. Otherwise, it would be the geistliche Welt or something like that. It's Geisterwelt. And that's what it meant. And you have the famous quote from the Faust by Goethe, which really says it exactly. Die Geisterwelt ist nicht verschlossen. Dein Sinn ist zu, dein Herz ist tot. Which means the world of spirits is not closed. It is your spirit that is closed. Your heart is dead. So that's exactly, literally, what Kerner and Eschenmayer were saying. This world of spirits is everywhere. It's visible, but if your heart is closed and if you close yourself off, then you will not see it. So when the Enlightenment thinkers say it doesn't exist, it's an illusion, that is because they have closed their perceptual organs against the perception of this Geisterwelt. And so this quotation from the Faust is really exactly, almost you can put it as a motto above the philosophy of Eschenmayer and Kerner. The Geisterwelt.
Let me ask you a kind of interrelated question. With your knowledge, with your writings on gnosis and Hermeticism, is this kind of secret knowledge? Is this what, or maybe esoteric knowledge? Is this what interested you in the story of Kerner and the Seeres of Prevorst. There's a kind of secret knowledge of spirit, of the spiritual world. And here is a seer with with a system of solar circles, giving us knowledge, arithmetic knowledge, and, being healed through this somnambulistic trances. And do you see a kind of interrelation between this? Sorry, mesmerism. I meant mesmerism, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. No, this is all part of the history of esotericism as we study it. So yeah, no, this is just one. So the Seers of Prevorst and Kerner and Eschenmayer are just one chapter in a story of many, many chapters of esoteric traditions from antiquity to the present. And my approach here, I approach this as an historian. I'm not making claims that it is true. I cannot. How could I? So when Friedrich Wilhelm makes these claims about the spiritual world, as an historian, as a scholar, I cannot. I have no instruments for checking whether that is true or not. I leave that open. It's what I call methodological agnosticism. So I really leave that open. But I do think that there's absolutely no reason not to take these traditions very seriously. So my concern is that these kind of traditions, this kind of alternative types of knowledge based upon these foundations have just as much right to be taken seriously as standard philosophical or scientific theories have the right to be taken seriously. So I'm not making any claim that they are better or worse, but I say they deserve their place at the table, and they deserve to be taken seriously. And that is not what happens, because what you see also in the history of philosophy, certainly since the 18th century, 17th, 18th centuries, that these kind of dimensions have been written out of philosophy as non-philosophical, as superstitious, as irrational, and so on and so forth. And yeah, then my argument against that line of reasoning is that, listen, read the sources. Great philosophers, they write about it. They took it seriously. So why should we as scholars of philosophy not take it seriously? And this goes back already to Plato himself. I remember years ago, I was making this argument to a group of students at the University of Amsterdam. And I remember we had a very bright student of philosophy who was totally disturbed by what I was saying about Plato. And he said, yeah, but Plato is a philosopher. I said, yes, he's a philosopher. But you are saying that Plato is talking about altered states of consciousness, states of mania, divine madness. And that is not philosophy, he says. That is philosophy is rational. He said, okay. I said, but what are you interested in? Are you interested in Plato? Taking Plato seriously? Yeah, Plato is a great authority, he's a great philosopher. Well, Plato found this important. So why don't you take that important? It is in Plato. It is not something I am imposing on it. It's right there in the text, in the Phaedrus and in other places. And this is the point. This is the point for all these things. The same goes for Immanuel Kant, Träume eines Geistersehers, dreams of a spirit seer, which has been dismissed. I've done research on this. It has been dismissed as a kind of like he was just making fun of Emanuel Swedenborg, the famous author about visions of heaven and hell and so on. So he writes his whole book, Dreams of a Spirit Seer, about Swedenborg. And later historians of philosophy have basically, until very, very recently, have been totally dismissing this book as a kind of an amusing attempt to make fun of a crazy guy like Swedenborg. But if you read the book carefully, then you see that Kant was actually having a very, very serious debate with Swedenborg about essential questions that later turn up in his mature, critical philosophy. So you have to integrate Swedenborg into the study of Kant. You cannot just dismiss this. And the same goes for all these later authors. I think for all the German idealists, I don't think there would be any exception. you have to take this thing seriously. It's there. They talk about it. So
Yeah,
deal
part
with
of
it.
yeah,
So,
part of yeah, part no no
yeah.
no, part of the reason why I'm doing this series is to speak about specific minor figures that are important. So I had an episode on Carl Friedrich Christian Krause, who was a
Oh, yeah.
huge inspiration to Schopenhauer and getting Schopenhauer interested in Hinduism and Buddhism and the Vedic texts. I plan on doing an episode on Rudolf Steiner and anthroposophy, but also what I wanted to bring up, which was interesting when I was listening to you speak, was that a lot of these thinkers were interested in the Orphic cults and Samothrace. Look at the magical idealism of someone like Novalis. So I mean, there's lots of these ideas, and so I want to thank you so much for coming here and giving us such a rich reading of both Eschenmayer and Justinus Kerner and the Seeres of Prevorst or Friedrich Haufa. So thank you so much for being here and for doing this, Dr. Hanegraaf. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. And these are important topics. And I'm very happy that you are, like you say, that you are paying attention to these neglected figures, these minor figures next to the great figures, because I do think that that is exactly what we need to do. So I wish you a lot of success with the further development of the channel, because I think it's really important that we do this. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you too. Bye-bye.